time. Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin daf men bet. The beginning of our daf is a little bit confusing in terms of where we're going, and I'll continue to kind of pull you back in so that you keep track, but I highly recommend you use, there's a big chart on the first side of the today's study guide. It'll definitely help you focus you, even if Hebrew's not great, but if some basic Hebrew, you'll be able to follow the flow of the chart and where we're going. We're starting off, we started yesterday with this machloket between Rebbi and the rabbis, whether someone who frees half of their slave, does that work? Right? We saw where if you have two masters and one freed entirely and the other one didn't, you can end up with a situation of a chetzi eved, chetzi ben cholim. The question is it effective if you free your slave part way and you retain part ownership? The real issue becomes how similar is this to get? You can't, where we continually see this connection between get. The whole thing of a get with a woman is you can't free a woman without freeing her entirely. If you have a divorce, a man divorces his wife but retains this connection with her, right? And the get kritut is not a separating document, right? Kritut means it has to separate between. If it doesn't fully separate them, then they're not divorced at all, right? It's not like you're partially divorced. There's no such thing. So since there's this gzera shava, la, remember we saw by Shifcha Harufa yesterday, it says la, and by the Eved, by the woman, it says v'katav la, and there's a tradition. We have a gzera shava, we compare it. We're going to see another comparison to divorce today. So there's this debate. Can you do this or not? Right? The other one was hefte lo nifdata, because it seems to indicate this double language of she's redeemed and not redeemed. We see you actually can do it. Is it b'kesef? Is it b'shtar? We had a whole debate about that yesterday. But today we're going to start there. Yesterday we had a machloket Rabba and Rav Yosef about that debate. Is it b'kesef? Is it b'shtar? Is it both? I'm a Rabba. Rabba again comes and talks about this machloket and says, starting at the top of our daf, machloket b'sheshichrem chatzio v'hiniach chatzio. This whole debate that we've been discussing is if the owner redeems half and leaves half for himself or herself. But aval shichreo chatzio umachar chatzio. But if I'm the owner of the slave and I free the slave part way and I sell the other part of the slave, or I gave him as a gift to somebody else, then since, again, let's make the comparison to get. This slave is now entirely out of my domain. Now the slave happens to be only half free, but for me, the slave is gone, not having anything to do with me anymore. Divrei hakol kana. According to Rabba, everyone would agree that this works. So even the rabbis who said on the previous daf, it doesn't work to free half your slave. If I free my slave halfway and sell the other half or give it as a gift, it works. Well, comes Abaye with a big question. This is what's going to take us almost to the end of this side of the page. Abaye's question. Amalei Abaye, that's his question is not going to take us, but dealing with his question is going to take us almost to the end of this side, and that's what the whole first side of the study guide is a chart charting this out. Amalei Abaye. Abaye says, Ubekula lo pligi, you don't think there's a machloket if you free the slave entirely, again, which would mean free the slave partway and give him as a gift to someone or sell him partway. You don't think there's a machloket? I'm going to prove to you there's a machloket. How is he going to prove it? He's going to take two braitot, which seem to be saying the same thing. And one says it works and one says it doesn't work. And Abaye is going to basically say the fact that there's two braitot saying the same thing, which is going to relate to a case where he's partially freed and partially given as a gift to someone. And one says yes, and one says no, right? It's effective, it's not effective. Must be machloket Rebbi and the rabbis. That's basically what Abaye is going to do. We'll see it inside now, but I wanted you to see it outside to get the concept. The response to Abaye is going to be, no, the difference between braitot A and braitot B is not Rebbi rabbis machloket. No, they actually, it's all one approach, and they all agree that theoretically this could work, but there's some differences between the cases. The reality was different, what happened was different, and we're going to get into what the differences are, okay? And we're going to have 4 other ways of resolving the contradiction. The first 2 are going to remain, the second 2 are going to be rejected. But, and on each of them, and this is why it's going to get confusing, if you look at the chart, you can see we're going to have 4 resolutions besides the one that Abaye, so in the end, there's 5 resolutions here. And on each one, we're going to have we're going to go off and say, really? How does this work? We're going to have some difficulty that we'll either resolve or we won't resolve. So that's what's going to happen, and that's why it's going to be a little confusing. But in the end, if you keep the basic structure, it'll help you to organize. So here's Abaye's proof that it doesn't work. It says in one braitot, if you write a document giving all your possessions to two slaves, okay, which means I write a document to one slave, I'm giving you all my stuff, I'm writing to the other slave, I'm giving you all my stuff, and basically it's clear somehow they're going to share them. And what happens? So each one only gets half, because if I give them, now here's also an issue, has to be at the same time. I give them at the same time to both. So in that moment, what happened? Well, each gets half. If you get half, and you're my slave, let's say, you're included in my possessions. So when I give you half of my possessions, I've given you half, I free you halfway. But you're owned halfway by the other person, because you both at the same moment acquired half of yourself and half of the other person. So what happens? Kanu, it works. They each acquire half their freedom. Here you're going to see, right? This is our case. The master freed them entirely from his domain, but they're each half free and half owned. And mishacharin zeh zeh. Okay, now each of them, because they each really want their freedom, and right, each one's going to say, well, you free me and I'll free you, and then that's how they're going to be free. That part's less relevant to our purposes. Vitani idach, the other braitot says, ha'omel, someone who says, kol nechasai netunim leploni avadai. All my possessions are given to so-and-so and so-and-so, my slaves. Af atzmam lo kanu. Not only do they not get any of his possessions, but they don't even get their own freedom. Okay, this isn't viewed as he freed them. What's the problem? The problem is that what happened? Neither one got their freedom. We're going to have to see why. Neither one got their freedom, and since they didn't get their freedom, they don't get anything else, because masha kana avdo kana rabo, because they're still the possession of the master. So if I give this document to two of my slaves, what happens? As soon as this means nothing, they don't get anything then, because anything they get, even if I give them all my other property, goes right back to me, because I'm owning them. So it doesn't work. So comes Abaye and he says, isn't it obvious that why do we have these two braitot? One says it works and one says it doesn't work. My love, Rebbi, Rabbanit. This is a classic case of they freed half. He freed half the slaves, or she freed half the slaves. And now, how are we going to resolve this? One is Rebbi, who says it works, and the other one's Rabbanit, who says it doesn't work, and that would be the obvious resolution. So, what's the problem? Well, the Gemara says, not the problem, but this is Abaye raises this question to Rabba, and Rabba is going to answer, or the rabbis are going to answer for him, lo, idi v'idi Rabbanan. No, you can explain the contradiction. As I told you, we're going to have 4 other resolutions to the contradiction between these two braitot. Idi v'idi Rabbanan. But the reality of each case is different. Notice they were even worded differently. It wasn't the same wording. So we're going to come up with what's the difference. Hada amar kulo, hada amar chetzi chetzi. The first case where it works is going to be where you said everything. So because you give each one everything, but the problem is you gave each one everything at the same moment. So that means each one only has a claim to have. But each one gained the entire thing and then had to split it with the other. So they each actually had half. But im amar chetzi chetzi, I'm giving you each half, then it doesn't work. Why? Great question. Okay? Lots of different options among the commentaries. The Gemara doesn't really tell us why this doesn't work. I'll explain the way I understood the Ramban. Okay, you can look at other commentaries to see. The Ramban explains it, made the most sense to me. That what happens if I give you everything, then basically I've given out all my possessions, and again you guys have to split it 50-50 because you each have a claim to everything, so it's kind of like shnayim ochazim b'talit, we split it. It's a little different than that, but I'm just kind of giving an example. But now if I said I'm giving you half, according to the Ramban, I'm not actually giving you the possessions. When I say half, what I mean is assess the value. Let's say my whole estate is $1 million. So we're now going to split it. Half is going to go to you, half is going to go to you, which basically means you get $500,000 worth of my estate, but you didn't actually gain anything. Okay? So you don't, in other words, not that you didn't gain anything, you have rights to demand now $500,000 worth of stuff of mine, but nothing was actually transferred to you. Okay, that's how chetzi works. It means nothing was transferred to you. Now, if nothing was transferred to you, then you didn't gain your freedom, because all you have is rights to demand $500,000 worth of my stuff. But that's not your freedom, because I didn't give you anything. Again, why chetzi and kula? It's a good question why it works that. Now, I see someone asked, so let me be clear about this. The braitot doesn't say, although in a minute we're going to see it does say chetzi, but let's just assume right now, they're just assuming, and this is what we call an ukimta. It didn't say so, but we're going to claim that that's what it is. That's the way we assume to read the Gemara right now. That even though it didn't say, we have to come up with some reason why one source would say it worked and one source would say it didn't work. And we don't want to say Rebbi and the rabbis, because Ravina said they don't argue in this case. They all agree it works. So why wouldn't it work? It must be there's something else that they didn't say that was going on in that case. That's right now the way we understand. To which the Gemara says, how can you possibly say that second braitot, again, I'm going to read it. And if you have the chart in front of you, you can just easily go back to it, because we're going to keep going back and reading it. If you say all my possessions are given to so and so and so and so my slave, they don't even get themselves and not anything else then. Well, that's a case where you said chetzi. That's what we're going to assume right now. But hamidikatani seifa, but wait, you didn't quote us the rest of that braitot. But the end of that braitot says, after the line where if you say all your possessions they can't acquire themselves. Ve'im amar chetzi lo kanu. Then it says after that, and if they said chetzi, if the owner said half, it wouldn't work either. Now, if you say kol nechasai in line 1, and in line 2 you say chetzi, well, it seems pretty obvious that mifal dereisha damar kula. That rejects our answer, because if it says chetzi in the second line, it means the first line must be kol nechasai, the way it sounds, everything. To which the Gemara answers, no. And to the person, I didn't even notice who asked, but to the person in the chat who asked, where they come up with this chetzi, now you're going to see where they came up with it. Because what they're going to say is, line 2 was explaining line 1. Perushe kamefaresh. Afatzman lo kanu. In other words, it's explaining when it says they don't even acquire themselves. Ketzad, how? Kigon de amar chetzi. So that there's a transition between line 1 and line 2, and what it's telling you is, line 1 is only true, it only won't work if you say chetzi. And now it's actually used as a proof that that's the resolution. The fact that it says chetzi, now I'm going to answer your question much better, which is, because it says it in that braitot, and the way they understand the line 2 is that it's explaining line 1. And that's our answer. So now, again, instead of Abaye, who tried to say Rebbi, rabbis, and that contradicted what Rabba said, because Rabba said they don't argue in this case, well, we have an answer, which is kulo, chetzi. The braitot are talking about 2 different scenarios. Now the Gemara, so I wanted to get you very clear on that before we go on, because what we're going to do now is do something else and undo it. So we're basically going to be left with where we are right now. That's what I want you to remember. Now we're going to try to prove that really line 2 is coming to explain line 1. And chetzi is trying to explain kol nechasai. It's in a case of chetzi, and that's why lo kanu. But their attempt to prove it is going to be rejected. Okay, so in the end, we're going to still be where we are now, which is this is a resolution. It's just our proof of trying to strengthen it isn't really going to work. Hachinami with Stavra can also understand it this way. The Isa Kedat Hakresha Damar Kulo, Hash Damar Kulo Lo Kanu Amar Chetzi Mebaya. Once you say that if I say all my property to you isn't going to work, then I have no point to bring another line that says if I say half, you're getting half my property to each of them isn't going to work. Obviously, if I give them all, it's not going to work, then chetzi is for sure not going to work. So there's no point to bring chetzi if not to explain line 1. Because once you have line 1, if line 1 literally means what it sounds like, kulo, like the previous braitot, then chetzi is no chiddush. It's obvious. So therefore, it must be coming to explain. But the Gemara is going to reject that proof and say no. Imshum halo iria. Tana seifa legaluye reisha. No, that's not a good proof, because if you just said kol nechasai, and the whole point is, right, don't bother with chetzi. If you meant kol and chetzi, you don't need chetzi. If kol meant kol. To which the Gemara says no. Kol, and that's why kol must mean chetzi. And now they're going to say no. Kol could have meant kol, okay, everything. But you still need a chetzi. Why? So that you know, and you wouldn't think kol meant chetzi. If you just have one line, you might have thought, okay, we're now going in the mindset of Abaye. The kol is really kol, right? We're rejecting it to say, don't think kol is chetzi. Line 2 is not explaining line 1. Line 2 and line 1 are two separate cases. Why did you need both? Because if you only had one, even if it said kol, you would have thought that kol is chetzi. Because you'd say, why wouldn't kol should work? So you would say, why doesn't this work? It must be a case of chetzi. So once they give you two cases, kol and chetzi, it's clear, although it's not clear because we just said maybe it's coming to explain, but theoretically you could say it's clear they're two separate cases and neither of them work. And then you would need it. That's what it means, tana sepa legalui eration. The second line came to make it clear that we understood what the first line was, which is, shalo tomar reisha damar chetzi. Don't think when it said kol, it meant chetzi. Aval amar kulo kan, if you would think that kulo would work, tana sepa damar chetzi, michal de reisha damar kulo afilu hafilo kan. So once they bring you two cases, it's clear that both these cases don't work. Now, it's funny to say it's clear because it wasn't so clear, and we just suggested that maybe 2 is coming to explain 1. But basically, they tried to bring an extra proof, how we know that it really means chetzi, because otherwise there'd be no point to say chetzi. In which case, they said, no. There still would have been a point. If they really meant, again, we don't think they did, but if they really meant kulo, you would still need the chetzi case to make sure that you thought kulo was actually kulo. Okay, like I said, that's an aside. It's a little confusing. If you didn't get that, it's fine. Okay, listen again, but it's not germane to our topic. So right now, we have, let's just review what we have. We have two braitot that seemingly contradict. Abaye says the only way to resolve a contradiction, one is Rebbi, one is the rabbis. That goes against Rabba, who tried to say someone who frees half a slave and the other half gives as a gift to someone or sells, in this case, he gives as a gift and removes himself entirely. Everyone agrees it works, but it doesn't because one side says no. Comes the second resolution and says, no. They don't disagree. These braitot don't contradict each other. They're each talking about different scenarios. One is where you said everything, that works. One is where you said half, which again, the way we explained according to the Rabbanit is you really only gave the value of half your stuff, which means you didn't free them at all. And if you don't free them at all, then it goes back to the avadim, and that's why what goes to the avadim goes right to their master, and that's why it doesn't work. So there's no contradiction because they're two different cases. Second rejection of Abaye, third resolution entirely, and a third way to explain these two braitot. Ibaydin lo kasha. It's a different case, again, but not because he said chetzi or kulo. It's that he gave one document to both, or he gave two documents. Now, let's go back to our comparison to get. Does it work to give two women one get document? Of course not. Each one katav la, for her specifically. So if you give one document freeing both slaves, and again, this isn't a freedom document, but within it is their freedom, it doesn't work. That's the second braitot. And the first braitot where it does work is b'shnei shtarot. So which again, the Gemara is going to ask. If you're saying b'shtar echad, it's one document and that's why it doesn't work, my area chetzi. Again, you're going to have this problem with line 1 and line 2. What's the point of line 2 in the second braitot of chetzi? Afilu amar kulo nami lo kana. It's basically where we were before. What's the point of having line 1 and line 2 if they're two separate cases? To which they say, hachi nami kamar. Here's a different way to read those two lines. Af atzman lo kanu. Okay, when it says, right, you said all my nechasim, kulo. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because you only wrote one star. Remember, we're in option 3, where that's how we're explaining that braitot. You wrote it all in one document. It doesn't work. Bamed dvarim amurim. So now we have to add that into the braitot here. In what case are we talking about? B'shtar echad, if you wrote one document. Aval b'shnei shtarot kanu. But if you had written 2, it would have worked. However, now there's the big transition to line 2. Im amar chetzi, af b'shnei shtarot nami lo kanu. But if you said chetzi, even in 2 separate documents, it wouldn't work. So basically, we have case number 1 in the second braitot is you wrote 1 star, but you wrote kulo. That doesn't work. If you wrote 2 documents, then that doesn't work because there's no such thing as releasing 2 slaves in 1 document. According to the second line is coming to say, but even if with 2 documents, if you said chetzi, that wouldn't work. And then we could go back to the Ramban's explanation why chetzi wouldn't work, or whoever explanation you want to accept. So that was resolution number 3. So we have these 2 resolutions, number 2 and number 3. either kulo chetzi chetzi or shtei shtarot shtar echad. And those are two possible ways to read the braitot without Abaye's explanation, meaning it can fit with Rabba, that really Rebbi and the rabbis agree. Here in the braitot where it doesn't work, right there they agree it works. In our braitot where it doesn't work, it's because it was a unique situation. Either he's a chetzi only, which doesn't work, or it was one document. Now we're going to have options 4 and 5, which are going to also do the same idea here, but both of them in the end are going to be rejected. So ibayit ema, another option. Kam bevat echad, kam bezer charzeh. If you gave them the documents at the exact same moment, this would work. If you did it bezer charzeh, if you did it one after the other, it wouldn't work. Okay, now it would have to be, again, you said kulo, you said you gave them 2 different documents, but you did it one after the other. Okay, so now, what's the issue here? The issue is that when you do it bezer charzeh, you free the first one, and what happens? When you free the first one gets their document, okay, and they, just one second, I want to check one thing. Okay, so now what happens? If the master frees the first slave, what happens basically? He gets everything, which means he gets the other slave. And then once he gets rights to the other slave, and then the second document comes and says, you have all the rights. And then he's supposed to, right? Basically, it's the master is freeing the second slave part way, but he's not freeing the second slave part way because the second slave is already owned by the first slave. So it doesn't work. Now, right now, the Gemara is kind of assuming that since it doesn't work for one, it's not going to work for the other. And that when he wrote these 2 documents, since he wrote them at the same time, telling each one, you get all of my possessions, which he really meant to say everyone's going to get 50-50. But if one gets everything, and then the other one can't get his freedom here because who's freeing him? The person who's no longer his master. Well, then that's not going to work. And then obviously the first one won't work either. And as I shouldn't say obviously, it's what's not going to be obvious in a minute. But right now the assumption is that these are supposed to work together. But the problem is he gave them first one and then he gave the other. And that's not going to be effective. So that's why lo kan. Okay, again, you have to explain, this is what we call an ukimta. That braitot was in a particular situation where it was given one after the other. And that explains the difference between the 2 braitot. But the Gemara rejects this because it says, exactly for what I was kind of getting at before, Bishlam abatra lo kane daha kane lekama. The second one can't acquire his freedom because he's already belonging to the first slave who got his freedom already and no longer by the owner, so that document is useless. But elakama liknei nafshe v'liknei lechavre. But the first one, like I said, should theoretically be able to get his own freedom entirely and then own the other slave. And theoretically, what do you mean lo kane? It works for the first slave. It just doesn't work for the second slave because now it's rejecting what the Gemara thought before, which is who's to say they're dependent on one another. If he gives one first, it says all your property goes to me. He gets all the property. The second one he gives is useless because the property is no longer owned by him. So therefore, they don't like this option. They say go back to options that we mentioned previously. 5th answer, notice the language is different in both braitot. In the second braitot, it says, okay, first it just says you write your kol nechasam to your 2 slaves. It doesn't say what your language you use. But in the second one, it says someone who says kol nechasai netunim leploni uploni avadai, he calls them slaves while he's freeing them. Well, if you're calling someone a slave, then then you're actually saying, I really don't want to free you. So when he writes all his possessions, it sounds like he's not actually giving them their freedom. Maybe he's giving them everything else. But obviously, anything else he gives them can't go to them because if they're still slaves, it goes back to him. So because he calls them slaves, it's kind of like when you put the tefillin on him. He showed he was free. Here he's calling them slaves. He shows, I still want them to be my slaves. But Raphaim Bar Papa doesn't like this. Amarle Raphaim the Rabba Ashi. Dilma avadai shayu kfal. No, he's just referring to them as his slaves. He's saying, you who used to be my slaves, who are no longer going to be my slaves. And how do we know this? Because Milotnan, doesn't it appear in a Mishnah? If you write all your possessions to your slave, you go free. He goes free. But that's exactly our case here. But shiur, it's not exactly, because our case is two people, but it's the idea that when you give all your possessions and it includes the slave, then you're basically giving him his freedom. Shiur karka koshu lo yatsa l'chirut. If you leave over, though, a little bit of land, you say you get everything except a little piece of my property, but you don't specify which property. So now none of your property goes to the Eved. And Tanakama says, not only that, since you said all my possessions, but then it's not including land, it's not going to include anything, and he's not going to basically go free. Okay, it doesn't include himself as well. Even though you were only talking about land, it still means it's not including him at all. Rabbi Shimon Omer, what are you talking about? He didn't say anything about slaves. He held back only land. Land is land, slaves are slaves. You get your freedom. La'olamu ben chorin. The only problem you won't be a ben chorin is if you say something very general, like Ad shiomar kol nechasai netunim leploni avdi. You say, all my possessions were given to my, now notice the wording here, to Ploni, my slave, just like by us, other than 1 out of a 600th of my possessions. Now, this was a general term. He left over a teeny weeny bit, but of something that he didn't specify. This could be he left over a teeny bit of the slave, which means the slave's not free. Now, what does this have to do with our topic? Well, what did Rabbi Shimon say? It doesn't work if you say this language, saying, all my stuff is given to my slave so-and-so, other than 1 out of 600. But what if he skipped the words and said, ploni avdi, to ploni, my slave? It would work, right? It's clear from Rabbi Shimon that would work, even though in the end, he's calling him a slave. So, so this is a total rejection of Rabbi Ashi's position. Says, what are you talking about? Here also it uses ploni avdi, and it would have worked had he used the right language at the end, right? If he cut off those few words, it would have worked, because avadai really means, or avdi means my slave that was, and not, doesn't mean I'm keeping you as my slave, and therefore you can't explain the second braitot in that way. So we're left with, as I told you, there are 5 explanations altogether. One is Abaye, who uses his explanation to reject Rabba. We had 2 explanations, even though we questioned them, we actually resolved the problems with them. Then we had 2 that we actually rejected. So altogether 5 resolutions. Now we're moving on to the second part of the daf. Nigachoshor. We now have a guy who's a half slave and half free. Okay, he was freed by his master, let's say one master, and now he has one master on him. What does he do? He works one day for himself. Next day, right, when he can go out and make money, the next day he works for his master. Next day himself, next day his master. That's what happens with him. He can't get married because, again, he's got this double status. But he can work and he can make money half the week, and half the week he works as a slave. So what if, nigachoshur, now we're going to get into Baba Kama sugyas. If a shore comes and gores a slave, what happens? The owner of the shore, the ox, pays damages. Who does he pay damages to? Well, if he's a slave, the damages go to the master. If he's his own person, the damages go to himself. So what happens in this case? Now, what would you think? Maybe 50-50, right? Well, the Gemara says something strange here. And it doesn't say who says this statement. Just remember that for later. Nigachoshur, yom shel rabo lerabo, yom shel atzmo la'atzmo. This is like a gamble. It all depends on what day it happened. If it happened on the day that he was working for himself, he gets the damages. If it happened on a day that he was working for his master, then the damages go to the master. To which the Gemara says, that means we're basically treating you as one day this, one day that for everything. If that's so, elameata, yom shel rabo yisa shipcha, yom shel atzmo yisa bat chorin. Then why don't you just get married, depending on what day it is? If it's a day you're a slave and you get married, marry a maidservant. If it's a day you're free, marry a Jewish woman. If we're saying your status on that day is just this, we go by your status on that day. Should be able to get married. Which the Gemara obviously answers, Isur lo kamrina. That's Isur. We're talking about Dine Mamano. Where does the money go? Money is always easier to kind of say, oh yeah, let's just say this. But when it comes to Isurim, of who you can marry, who you can't marry, that already is a whole different realm. You can't compare. That was question number 1. Question number 2 is going to be a little bit more complicated. That was a case of damages. Now, in a case where the slave gets killed by an ox gored the slave dies, what happens? If he's a slave, the owner gets 30 shekels. It's one of those places like rape, where the Torah gives a knas, an amount. This is the amount you pay. 30 shekels. Okay, it's not shekels like our shekels. It was 30 shekel kesef. Okay, it was a more value. If he's free, then you pay kofel, you pay a ransom amount of the value of the person to the family. This is like nowadays, right? There's someone kills someone, you can make them pay the family damages, right? As opposed to normally, if a human in Jewish law kills, they just get killed. The family doesn't get damages. But in the case where your ox gored, the family gets a kofer yushat alav, right? He basically what they say is the owner really should have died, but because he didn't watch his ox. But since he didn't do it directly, the Torah says you get to pay a ransom payment and pay your way out of the death penalty. So now the question is, what happens if he meet mishachatzu ebed v'chatzu ben chorin? Now, according to this, what would you say? It all depends on what day it happened. If they killed him on the day that he was working for himself, then his children, his heirs, should get the payment, the ransom payment. If it happened on a day he was a slave, the owner should get the 30 shekel. But that's not what it says. And this is going to be a question on the previous. Noten chatzi knas l'rabbo, turning now to Amud Bet, v'chatzi kofer liyorshav. So we split it 50-50. Half of the knas, okay, we get half knas to the owner and half ransom to the kids. It's not exactly split it 50-50 because each one is ruled differently. There's ransom payment for one and there's knas for the other. But since each one is only a half owner of, right, he only half owns himself and the owner only half owns him. So we're going to, each payment is going to be cut in half. And each one's going to get half of the payment they were deserving. Amat, why? Based on what we just said. Why don't we just say it all depends on the day it happened? To which the Gemara distinguishes, and this maybe explains a little bit the first one, even though the first thing we saw is a little hard to understand. Why should the owner of the slave lose out or the slave lose out himself if it happened to happen, randomly on the other day? Well, Shane Hacha de Kakal Yakarna. In this case, where the slave died, let's say the master or the family loses out entirely. They'll never have that person again in their lives, right? They'll never have the free person, the family, and the owner will never have his slave back. So there's what we call a total loss, right? It's completely, the slave is gone. So because of that, we really need to compensate each side because they each really lost. Whereas now what's going to be, this is going to be a bit of a problem. But the case of the earlier case where we're talking about damages for something they did to the ox did to the person, but didn't kill the slave, that's something that he'll recuperate entirely, okay, completely, right? Because Karya Karna, let's say he breaks his arm and let's say his arm gets cut off, okay? If his arm gets cut off, he'll never be the same again. So that would be more like the death case. So we have to have a case here where I don't get damages at all because it wasn't on my day, let's say, if I'm the owner, that would have to be a case where in the end, let's say 10 days later, maybe I'll lose a little bit of work for him, but 10 days later, he's going to be just as new. It's kind of damage that was, reversible damage. So now, Ella hechidami de lo kal karna. But wait, what would be a case of that? So here they give an example. Kigon. Shikal al yado, but some yado. Let's say he got hit on his hand shriveled up, didn't work so well. But in the end, it will go back to itself. I don't know exactly what kind of hand shriveling up they're talking about, but whatever it is, it's something that will go back to itself. Now this is going to be a problem though, because there's a machloket Abaye Rabba, a very interesting machloket, about something very basic, okay, in damages. So now we have to zoom out for a minute and learn something else. When an ox gores a person, they pay what's called nezek, damages. When a person damages another person, this is Perek HaChovel in Baba Kama, he has to pay 5 things. Nezek, tzal, ripoy, shevet, uboshet. Okay, we don't have time. I don't want to go into all of them, but we're going to talk about 2. Nezek is damages, which is going to be the exact debate. What does damages mean? Okay, how do we assess damages? And shevet is the amount of time that you are not going to be working, all the loss of work of all those days. So there's a basic machloket Rav and Abaye about how we deal with nezek, and particularly, what is nezek? So in a case where, let's say, you break your arm and your arm is cut off, let's say, you won't have an arm anymore. So we're now going to assess damages are the value you were worth before your arm was cut off, and the value you're worth in the shuk now, that you can do certain things, but you can't do lots of things. So your value goes down. That value is nezek. But if you're going to go back to being the same, then perhaps there are no damages. Because what are damages? Damages, now this is the question. Are damages long-term damages? Okay, like the hand, like the arm being cut off? Or are damages where you are today? Right now you got damaged. Let's see, if we sold you in the shuk today, what would you be worth? So you have a shriveled hand right now. Now, right now, you go to the shuk to sell someone like that. They look at you and they say, well, you have a problem, right? You're not worth, let's say you're worth 100 shekels. You're now worth 80 shekels because we know you're going to go back to being who you are. But right now, you're not so great. So I won't get work for the next few days. So that difference of 20 is what you're going to get paid. That could be damages for a case of low kal yakar. So that's what Abaye says. So according to Abaye, this works. Abaye, this all works fine if you're Abaye, because Abaye says there's shevet gdola and shevet ktana. What does that mean? Shevet is the amount of the payment you get for not being able to work. So Abaye splits it into two. He says you get shevet. Okay, this is if a person damages, because if an ox damages, there is no shevet. But what do you get? You get your shevet of not shevet ktana is okay. You didn't go to work for 5 days. You get a salary for 5 days. But what's shevet gdola? That's damages. Damages is, according to Abaye, we evaluate what you would cost in the shuk today on the day you got damaged. So then that would be what the damages we're discussing here. But ela l'Rava da'amal eino noten lo ela shivto shebachol yom vayom hai shol hu v'shor no mashalem ela nezek. This is a tricky part. Rabba says when you have an issue that's going to resolve itself, you don't get nezek. If it's a person damaging a person, there is no nezek. That's not called damages. The only thing you get is the days of work that you were missing. So according to him, now that means damages equals long-term damages only. If there's short-term damages, there's no damages payment. Now you get payment for other things. You get the tsar, the boshet, the report. You get your doctor's bills. You get all these other payments, but you won't get that. Now we have to take that to our case. Our case is not a person. Remember, a person gets all 5 things. So in this case, the person won't get nezek according to Rava. Nezek is gone. There is no nezek because it'll all be healed. But in our case, shor shenagach, there is only nezek. Now Rava defines nezek as long-term damages. In this case, we just explained in order to resolve this contradiction, we had to say it's only short-term damages. But I'm sorry, it's right that we're only talking about payment of short-term damages. According to Rabba, there is no such thing. You wouldn't pay in that case because Shor Shenagach only pays damages, and this isn't damages because damages is only long-term. So, according to Rava, this resolution doesn't make sense. So therefore, according to Abaye, it makes perfect sense because Abaye says there is such a thing, and that's exactly what you're talking about. And what we have here again is the question was who gets the payment. Does it go to me or does it go to the slave himself, depending on what day he was working? But there have to be damages to be discussing. According to Rabba, there are no damages in that case. So it's hard to say that's the difference between the case where he died. Case where he died, right? There were, we're going to split it 50-50. And that's because you're losing him entirely. And the case where he was only injured, you don't split it 50-50 because you're not losing anything, because in 10 days he'll go back to work. But that doesn't make any sense because there wouldn't be damages according to Rav. So again, according to Abaye, it makes perfect sense, according to Rabbanit. So we have 2 resolutions to say. One is, Kishikau, Ibait Ema Kishikau Adam. Maybe this statement that came with no name or anything, maybe it was a mistake the way we got it. Nigachoshor, maybe it's not Nigachoshor. Maybe if it's a person injures you. And then we're talking about the other payments, like the Shevet payment or the Sa'ar payment, and who does that go to? And it goes to the person who that was his day. Okay, and then it doesn't have anything to do with damages, and that resolves the problem. Or ibait ema memrahu memra l'Rabba lo svirale. Wasn't like it was a braitot. It wasn't. I mean, maybe it was a braitot, but right now they're saying no. It was just a statement by some emora. You could say Rabba just doesn't hold by that emora and simply resolve it in that way. Okay, so that was again. We brought this contradiction, and then we resolved how can it work. According to Abaye, you could just say kal yakar lo kal yakarna, right? The principle is gone or it's not gone, and that's the difference between them. Or according to Rebbi, you'd have to explain these other 2 ways. Now we have 2 main questions. The third one, I think, because of time, we'll leave for tomorrow. Anyway, the question kind of continues into tomorrow's daf. So we'll stop a few lines from the bottom. We have these 2 basic questions. So this is the simpler part of the daf. Me'ukav get shichur yesh lo knas o ein lo knas. We saw this situation where the owner freed the slave but didn't give him the get shichur yet. So if you remember, what does that mean? The slave is no longer the property of the master, but he is somewhat the property of the master because the master still needs to give him a get shichur, an emancipation document, to allow him to marry a Jewish woman, right? Till he becomes full-fledged Jew. So the question is, what if in that interim time period, he gets injured? He gets killed, does the knas, that payment, go to the owner or not? Now, what does the Torah say? Kesef 30 shkalim yitain le'adonav, to his master. Amar Rachmana, that's what the Torah says. So side one is to say, Hai lavadonu, he's no longer his master, because remember, he gave up his financial rights to the slave. O Dilma, or do we say, Kevanda mechusar get shechur adon karina be, or do we say, look, he still needs to give him an emancipation document, which means maybe he is still his master. So he's at this in-between stage, and both questions are going to be premised on this in-between stage, and what do we call, what's his status? So the first is for the status of the knas. Tashma, let's learn it from here. Oh, that's the source we saw before. If someone gets killed when he's a half eved, half ben chorim, he gives chatzi knas. Now, what do we know about a half eved, half ben chorim? If one master freed him, the other master, what do we learn? Has to free him. So he's kind of like has to free his slave, meaning he's mu'ukav get shechur. It's the same kind of case. It's a little different, but for a different reason, he has to free him, but it's the same idea. He's basically about to be freed, right? He's not exactly in his ownership. So, my lav ki mishnah achrona is not like the end of the Mishnah where Beit Hillel agrees with Beit Shammai, and therefore you have to free the slave, in which case he's mu'ukav get shechur. And then you'd have an answer. It does. You're still the master. You still get the knas. Lo ki mishnah rishona. No, you could say this was before Beit Hillel agreed. And before Beit Hillel agreed, you actually don't have to give him a get shechur, and he's your full-fledged slave, even though he's only half the days, but he's still your slave, and that's why you get the knas, and then you can't learn anything from here. Tashma, second source. Another thing about avadim, we're learning all these laws. If you knock out the tooth or you blind your slave, let's say you're beating him, right? There's a way to protect your slaves, he automatically goes free. So now, the assumption of the beginning of the sugya is he goes free, but you need to give him a get shechur. Okay, we're going to see later that that's a source of debate. But right now, assume you need to get shechur. He pila chino. Let's say you're in the middle of beating your slave, chas v'shalom, but let's say you are. He pila chino. You knock out his tooth. Simeat no, and then you blind his eye, one after the other. Yotze b'sheno. Okay, immediately goes free as soon as you knocked out his tooth. V'notein d'meino, and then you have to pay him for the damage you did to his eye because he was a free person and you blinded his eye. If you say that in between stage when he's supposed to get shechur, which right now we're assuming is what's supposed to happen here, you knocked out his tooth, he's free, but you didn't give him a get shechur yet, you still need to give him a get shechur, then, and if the knas goes to the master, then if I knocked out his tooth, he went free, I still need to give him a get shechur, but I have to pay him damages, that wouldn't make any sense. If someone else damaged him, I would get payment. If I myself damaged him, of course I would give it to myself, meaning I wouldn't have to pay damages. So that seems to prove that I don't get damages. Dilma kemanda amareno tzarich, to which the Gemara rejects, as you can guess, and says, no, maybe this is only according to the one who says you don't need to get shechur. And that means that the second I knocked out his tooth, he was 100% free. There is not like we're waiting for a get shechur. So, as we're going to see in this braitot, Ditanya, bekulan eved yotzei ben l'chilud, anything you knock out, the eved goes free. V'tzarich get shechur me rabo divrei Rabbi Yishmael, but the owner still needs to give him a get shechur. Rabbi Meir omer eno tzarich. Rabbi Meir says no, you don't. Rabbi Elazar omer tzarich. We're going to have a lot of back and forth. Rabbi Elazar says yes. Rabbi Tarfon omer eno tzarich. He says you don't need. Rabbi Akiva omer tzarich. Now, because there were so many different opinions, they say hamakruim lifnei chachamim omrim. There were people who tried to resolve this issue in front of the rabbis, and they said the following: Nir'im divrei Rabbi Tarfon b'shem v'ayin. When it comes to the ones that are mentioned in the Torah, Rabbi Tarfon is right that you don't need to get shechur because it says so in the Torah. They're free even without. Ho'il the Torah ziktalo. The Torah said you're free. You don't need the master to free. V'divrei Rabbi Akiva, who said you need it, b'sharei varim. Ho'il uknas chachamimu. If you knock out a different limb that's not written in the Torah, then, because the rabbis instituted a knas for this, then you would have to give him a get shechur, to which the Gemara says, knas? It's not a knas, a penalty the rabbis instituted. It's a drasha from the psukim, which they say, fine, change the wording, Okay, fine. It's a drasha from the Chachamim, but that makes it different from something explicitly in the Torah, and that's the distinction here. But the main point is, you can't necessarily use that source because that source could be just saying you're not missing a get shichur, in which case this has nothing to do with our topic. We don't have an answer. Next question. A slave gets to eat truma if they're owned by a kohen. What if you free them from your property, but you haven't given them a get shichur? Do they eat truma? Same basic question. Kinyan kaspo amar Rabbanit, it says who gets to eat truma? Those who are acquired by you financially. V'hailav kinyan kaspo, and you've given up your financial rights to. O dilma, or do we say kevan demechusar get shichur kinyan kaspo krinabe? Because the missing get shichur, he's still considered your property. So tashma, let's learn it from here. Funny kind of situation. Amar Masharshia kohenet shenitarev vlada bevlad shivchata. Let's say the woman of the house and the maidservant have a baby on the same day, and they mix up the babies. They don't know who's who. So you now have a kid who's a Safek Kohen, Safek Evet. It's a big difference. So what do we do with them? So first of all, they can both eat truma. Why? Because either you're an Evet in a house of a Kohen or you're a Kohen, right? So either which way you can eat truma. And that's a whole different issue. You're not allowed. There's some people who think, not everyone, that the Evet can't go on the line to get truma because people will think he's a Kohen and then they'll think they can marry him and they'll do a shidduch for him with a Jewish girl and it turns out he was an Evet. So it doesn't look right. So the only way you can go online is if you go with your master. So what do? We have these two kids. One is the master, one is the slave. We don't know who. Well, they can go together to the line because then at least they're together, right? One of them is the Kohen and one is the Evet. Higdilu hatarofot. This is the big part. Once they get older, mishacharim zeh. Each one frees the other. Kind of, if I'm the master, then I'm freeing you. If you're the master, I'm freeing you. Okay. So what do you see here? Because in the end, they're supposed to free each other. This is again a case of mu'ukav get shichur. What do you see? Right, you're waiting for a get shichur, and while you're waiting for that, you can eat truma. It's not exactly the same, but they try to compare. To which they say, "Hachiyashta, this is not the same." Hatamim yavo liyav yomar b'chad minayu de'evedhu kinyakas bokrina be. This is totally different. If Eliyahu were to come, this is basically just a way of saying, we don't know the status. But theoretically, if it's yes, you're a slave, then you're kinyan kaspo. If it's you're not a slave, well, then you're a Kohen. So either way, you can kind of be truma. And the doubt is just, if you really are, then you're kinyan kaspo. In our case, you're not kinyan kaspo. The whole point is you were freed partially, financially, but not in terms of the isurim, right? You're not a Jew yet. So that's not the same comparison, and therefore you can't learn anything from that. So a very quick review, because it was a long daf and it's late, but we basically have started with Rebbi and the rabbis, and Rabba's understanding of their machloket is not if the owner completely gives up his rights, right? Half freedom, half sold him, or half gave a gift. Abaye says, what do you mean? We have this braitot, and it contradicts, and the only way to resolve it is Rebbi, rabbis, and they do disagree in that case. So which we gave 4 other resolutions, 2 were rejected, 2 were accepted. How we can understand that. Then we got to the nagach shor. Yom echad shavabo, yom echad latzmo, right? Depending on which day, that's how you get damages. How does that work? We brought 2 questions. One was, what about why can't you just get married depending on what day it is? That was obviously easy to resolve. The other one was a little more complicated, which is, what about it when he gets killed? We split it, and we don't look at what day it was. Then we tried to say difference between principle, right? The principle's gone, the principle's not gone, which we then had a problem with Rabba. So according to Rabba, we had to explain it in 2 different other ways. Then we brought these 2 questions, which we didn't answer, which is someone who's waiting for a get shichur. Number 1, does the knas go to the master or not? Or, does he get his own damages? Or does he get to eat truma? And we didn't really resolve either of them because any source we brought to try to prove wasn't really a similar case. That's it for today. Wishing everybody a great day.